tardes. Es un placer agradecerles el interés y que nos acompañen en este ciclo de conferencias de Universidades por la Ciencia, organizado conjuntamente con Fundación UNAM, el Colegio Nacional y instituciones de educación superior y centros de investigación en el país y en el extranjero. El ciclo de conferencias ha sido particularmente exitoso y pues les agradecemos mucho a todos el que nos apoyen y apoyen esta iniciativa. El día de hoy tenemos una conferencia muy interesante sobre uno de los temas, pues yo creo que más importantes que tenemos para la vida, es los sistemas de reproducción y el papel que tienen los sexos. Y está a cargo de uno de los investigadores más destacados, el doctor Tamás Szélkely, de la Universidad de Bath en Inglaterra, del Centro Milner de Evolución, y quien es también profesor honorario en la Universidad de Debrecen en Hungría. El profesor Tamás, y a quien le agradecemos mucho el que acepte la invitación, trabaja en una gran cantidad de países. Es, yo creo que uno de los investigadores más internacionales que tenemos, y desarrolla una investigación muy interesante que nos ha permitido ver los detalles de cómo evoluciona la vida a través del sistema de reproducción. Cambio un poco al inglés. Tamás, thanks very much for accepting the invitation. We are very glad to have you here. And you have been a frequent visitor to our country and to the university, to UNAM. And we really appreciate your participation in this conference series. The conference series, Universities for Science, has been very successful over the past few months. And we have talks from many different universities and countries. And on behalf of the UNAM Foundation, the Colegio Nacional, and this group of universities, we welcome you, and we hope to see you in UNAM very soon. Thanks very much. El ciclo de conferencias forma parte de las actividades prioritarias de Fundación UNAM. Fundación UNAM tiene un conjunto de programas muy amplio, los programas de becas que apoyan a una gran cantidad de estudiantes para que continúen sus estudios, y adicionalmente Fundación UNAM tiene ciclos de conferencias, el Foro UNAM 2020, y desarrolla muchas actividades de apoyo a la investigación científica y a la divulgación de la ciencia. Es realmente es un honor el que nos acompañe el presidente de Fundación UNAM, el licenciado Dionisio Meade, y nuestra directora ejecutiva, la licenciada Araceli Rodríguez. Y les agradecemos nuevamente su colaboración. El ciclo fue iniciado conjuntamente con la Universidad de las Américas en Puebla y la UNAM, a cargo de los doctores Araxi Urrutia y Martín Serrano. Y le voy a pasar la palabra a nuestro presidente de Fundación UNAM, el licenciado Meade. Muchísimas gracias a todos.
Muy buenas tardes, un gusto, y subrayar nuevamente que el privilegio de participar en estos foros es para Fundación UNAM. Estamos muy contentos de participar y subrayar, como lo hemos hecho en ocasiones anteriores, que esta forma de comunicarse a través de este consorcio de universidades recoge una respuesta frente a la pandemia, en donde al evitarse los contactos presenciales, se encontró que una forma de comunicarse, de estar vinculados los interesados en la academia, en la investigación, era precisamente a través de las redes. Y esta serie de pláticas que se han venido dando, estas conferencias, están ilustrando apenas el potencial que puede derivar de una comunicación entre universidades. Este consorcio, originalmente de 14, nos está vinculando a todos y está permitiendo que tengamos un contacto más estrecho entre los distintos investigadores. Para nosotros en la Fundación, la investigación científica, el fomento a la docencia y la difusión cultural son nuestros propósitos, son nuestros objetivos, son nuestra razón de ser, un brazo que va de la mano de la universidad. Y estar vinculados con el Colegio Nacional, estar vinculados con la Universidad de las Américas Puebla y con tantas otras universidades que se han sumado a este esfuerzo, nos estimula porque sentimos que la capacidad de difusión que así se genera puede realmente iniciar un proceso muy novedoso, muy útil y muy fructífero para el intercambio entre universidades. Subrayo un elemento adicional. Nuestras presentaciones presenciales, por razones de capacidad, incluso de los auditorios, pues normalmente se agotaban en 150 o 200 personas. Hoy, al participar con científicos de distintas universidades del planeta, la capacidad de multiplicar los contactos y lo que hemos venido viendo a través de los interesados desde distintas partes del mundo que se suman a nuestras presentaciones, pues nos estimula a seguir adelante. Estamos muy contentos con estas presentaciones. Agradecemos al doctor Szélkely la presentación que hoy nos hace y subrayamos que el ánimo que está acompañando las conferencias actuales tiene que ver con un reconocimiento y un homenaje a dos científicos mexicanos formidables que nos acaban de dejar, al premio Nobel Mario Molina y al rector de la universidad Guillermo Soberón. Ellos fueron pioneros en la investigación, fueron sembradores del conocimiento y queremos nosotros que a través de estas presentaciones sean muchos más los que se vinculen a este espacio de conocimiento, a este espacio de interés por la investigación. De manera que al invocarlos en este homenaje, queremos motivar a muchos más, a muchos jóvenes, no solamente de México, sino de todos los que se suman a este consorcio y muchos más, que vean en la investigación científica un espacio de vida y que se den cuenta que solo a través de la educación y del conocimiento podremos ir sembrando los cimientos de un mundo mejor. Muchas gracias al doctor Szélkely por acompañarnos. Muchas gracias a Jaime por haber sumado al Colegio Nacional. Jaime es además miembro de nuestro consejo y miembro de la Junta de Gobierno de la Universidad, y a Araxi por haber generado esta idea formidable. Gracias a todos y encantados de escuchar esta presentación sobre este tema tan trascendente que tiene que ver con el origen de la vida en todas sus expresiones. Muchísimas gracias y buenas tardes a todos.
Muchas gracias, doctor Urrutia. Muchas gracias, licenciado Meade. It is a great pleasure to have Tamás, Professor Tamás Szélkely with us today. He is, as it has been said before, an academic at the University of Bath, a member of the Milner Center for Evolution, and he's also an honorary academic at the University of Debrecen in Hungary. It's a very big honor to have the Milner Center for Evolution as part of this consortium. Has been one of the main contributors of speakers so far. So Tamás is actually our fourth speaker from the Milner Center. And the Milner Center, among its three main pillars or objectives, it's actually to promote science communication. So it is a very, very good sort of synergy that we are finding here. So what I'm going to do is just scratch the surface of Tamás's achievements. So Tamás started his career as a PhD student at the University of Debrecen. He then moved to Bristol in the UK as a postdoc, and in 2000 or 2001 he joined the University of Bath as an academic. Over his very impressive research career, he has published the astonishing quantity of 300 papers and more, and counting. These include all of the journals in his field, as well as the top journals in science. So Nature, Science, PNAS, Current Biology, everything he has published. He's also published 4 books already. His contribution to the next generation of scientists has been equally impressive. He has supervised over 30 PhD students and over 15 postdocs so far. He is a specialist in sex strategies, sex roles, mating systems, and generally behavior in wild populations. But although his focus has been mainly in researching birds, he has also branched out into other taxa to tackle very fundamental questions in biology. He has received the Research Merit Award, the Wolfson Research Merit Award by the Royal Society, and he's also a foreign member of the Hungarian Academy of Science. As well as focusing on research, he's also a lead in the conservation foundation, the Mayo Foundation, that seeks to preserve species in Mayo. So, Tamás, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation. And over to you.
Hello, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good day. Many thanks to Jaime and Dionisio for introducing me. Let me just share my screen. Can you see the slide? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, welcome everybody. In this presentation, I like to talk about something which is very close to my heart. It's something asking why do males behave the way they do, and why do females behave the way they do. And one illustration to this issue could be a shorebird. It's called the painted snipe, where unlike in most birds, where the male is more ornamented and sometimes even bigger than a female, in this species, the plumage dimorphism are replaced or reversed. So the female, surprisingly, the more ornamented sex. So why is that? So before I talk about it, I would like to thank to the organizing panel, especially to Martín Alejandro Serrano Meneses, my former student, who is now a very important person, a great scientist, a wonderful friend, and also Araxi, who is also a wonderful colleague. We're publishing some great work, and I still hope that the best papers are still ahead of us. So many things, and muchas gracias. And the Spanish part of the presentation stop here, so I go back to English. Frida Kahlo was a brilliant lady, actually. So let's just focus a little bit on the art. So as we got older, unfortunately, age is very democratic. We all get older. Instead of just saying one particular small piece of pattern, which could be called a dissertation, which could be called a report. As we get older, we started to see how these pieces of puzzle are falling into places, and if we're lucky, we start to see some patterns. So if we look at the top left corner, it's just individual pieces. This could be a paper, it could be a grant, it could be anything what we're very proud of. But as it takes a long time to actually dribble down to the right bottom corner, where we start to see some patterns. Now, seeing a pattern is actually not a trivial issue. For many scientists, unfortunately, the pattern simply means doing a little bit of more details, just do a bit more cosmetics, just to paint a little bit more what we already done. You can see it on the left photograph of a horse. You can actually muck about a long time, just try to work out the details of the horse. But in science, often this is not the point. So the whole idea of science is grabbed by Hokusai, a Japanese artist. So if you look at the horse on the right, it is actually not really a horse, but few drawings. What is important? The mane, the tail, and the hooves, and this gives the characteristic of the horse. And remember, if you have a good supervisor, your good supervisor should say, "Oh, just don't worry about these tiny details. Just focus on this and that." And this is the difference between a very detailed picture, maybe a perfectionist picture, but actually fairly dull and boring, as opposed to something which grabs some key features of the organism. In this case, is the horse. So research, especially for the non-scientists, often sees some success. Some old blokes and old ladies become wonderful. They win a Nobel Prize. They are very famous. And it's often characterized in the media as a march towards success. I can tell you it isn't. So science in career is often full of dead ends. It's like a random walk with big bangs. You sometimes waste years. You waste a lot of effort, and you actually don't get anywhere. But if you're lucky, you start to see some directions and some patterns, as I mentioned in the first few minutes of this presentation. My main interest is on breeding systems. I like to understand how males and females interact. What are the roles of sexes in dragonflies, in guppies? Frogs have some of the most wonderful breeding systems and parental behavior on the whole planet. Why do snakes and mammals fight? And of course, the most peculiar species of all is Homo sapiens. Understanding their behavior needs a lot more than just pure biology. I began studying birds, and in the remaining part of this presentation, I will focus on birds. And birds and people have a very long shared history. I don't know how many of you know that in Roman times, an augur was a person who foretold the future of observing the behavior of the birds. So when there was a new Caesar, a new emperor came, the first thing the Caesar asked, from the augur, what's the prediction? And if the guy made the right prediction, he was richer by a big sack of gold. But if he made some mistake, he was one head shorter. So the Latin derivative from inaugurate is foretelling the future. Some people laughing, so it was a good joke. Yeah, thank you. So this is actually telling the future. So when you hear about inaugurals, when a president or some important people give a presentation, remember, this is nothing else than bird talk. Unfortunately, the current politics is indeed a bird talk with full of U-turns and full of not necessarily facts. Okay. Now, the second of birds and people are utility. You might be surprised to know that the number one number of meat we eat are chickens, okay? So this is vastly more than beef, pork, everything else, what we consume. So chickens are very important for us. But of course, culturally, we also benefit from hunting, like this Arab falconer or the cormorant fishing in Southeast Asia. We enjoy watching birds or keeping them at home. And you just imagine what would be the disaster of all white storks on the planet would stop delivering babies. There would be no newborn babies coming at all if these birds were just say, sorry, no more, I'm fed up. I'm not gonna do this very badly paid job, and I'm on strike. Okay, just imagine, that would be a collapse. The coronavirus is nothing compared to the strike by the white stork. Of course, the culture and society, the Book of Dead by the Egyptians is full of bird illustrations. And of course, in the New World, one of the sacred animals of the Aztecs were the quetzal. So the birds are reverenced in Papua New Guinea, in traditional tribes, and it's in the symbol of several countries. And luckily, the peace, the symbol of peace, is also a bird, a dove. Okay. So birds favor very high up in the science as well. Charles Darwin at some point was so crazy that he joined a pigeon fancier society. So a lot of the things, a lot of the science he picked up were actually not from nature, but from the pigeon breeders. He went on to summarize his information in major works like The Origin of Species, which, of course, the Darwin's finches illustrates some of the core ideas about natural selection. And his follow-up book on sexual selection, I counted, he devoted 214 pages dedicated to birds. This is at least in my edition. Okay, huge amount of information. Now, Darwin's footsteps were followed up by many excellent scientists, among them Konrad Lorenz, the ethologist who co-established the scientific field of study of animal behavior, or Nico Tinbergen. Lorenz was Austrian, Tinbergen was a Dutchman, who is seen actually in the right bottom corner painting gull eggs. He was a founder of behavioral ecology, and justly Konrad Lorenz, Tinbergen, and Carl von Frisch shared the Nobel Prize. And he must say, the committee must gone way out of the normal way to do these three gentlemen Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine, okay? Because they just studied animal behavior in the wild or in the nature. So why should somebody study breeding systems of birds? Well, the birds are actually fairly numerous, not as numerous as many insects, but they luckily occupy a variety of niches. They inhabit pretty much all continents, and nearly everywhere you find birds. They're very well studied in the wild, which cannot be said about many mammals, which are actually nocturnal, and they have a variable mating system and parental care, and we can use them to understand family dynamics, okay? And this is something what I got passionate a few years ago, and especially about a group of birds, what normally called are shorebirds. Shorebirds are some illustrations on this slides. You can see them on coastline, beaches, marshes, and wetlands. But some shorebirds actually live in mountains. You can see some Arctic species in Patagonia, high up in the seed stipes. In the snow, or the corsor, which is a classic desert or semi-desert species. So they live in a variety of environments. And indeed, Darwin picked it up that some of the shorebirds, and he used a ruff in his old name, actually, the Spugnas, to illustrate his theory. And what is a ruff? For a long time, I didn't know. And let me just illustrate this. We need to meander into human history as well. Ruff is like a big collar. So in fancy medieval times, the man and the woman wear these ruffs to show how rich they are. Ruffs also have this collar, and what the males use to fight off each other. So what Darwin noted in his book on sexual selection, that the ruffs are very aggressive. They fight with each other, and the males are bigger than the females, and only the females look after the young, okay? Darwin was hugely knowledgeable, and he also noted, and in many other shorebirds, this is not the usual roles, because there are species like the painted snipe, you can see it here, Phalaros rotoro, where the females are actually larger and more ornamented colored than the males. And interestingly, the males are the ones who look after the babies and not the females. So this is what he calls sex role reversal. And if you want to characterize this, we have two types of strategies. One are the conventional sexual species, where the males compete and the females look after the young. And you can also have the reverse of this, where actually the females compete for males and the males look after them. These are just two endpoints of a continuum. There are species which straddle between these two. Nevertheless, it is a good idea to think about this as a kind of endpoints of a scale, two endpoints. So Darwin's explanation, of course, he tried to explain everything from his theory, natural selection or sexual selection point of view. Interestingly, Darwin speculated that in a raft, there are many males in a population. So the only way these males can find a partner if they compete. So in his argument, sexual selection drove the males to fight and drove the females to take up the caring role. So following Darwin's logic, we would postulate that in sex-role species, there should be many more females, because in these species, the females are more ornamented. So they are the one who fights, and then the timid males look after the young. So this is what Darwin explained. Now, a while ago, I started to ponder over these issues, and because at that time I was based in Hungary, there was no painted style, no rough. Hungary is a small landlocked country. I picked a small dull-looking creature. This was the Kentish Plover, and started to investigate it. And I do believe that one explanation, one interesting explanation for the existence of sex was produced by this little dull species. So this is the Kentish Plover. It breeds on the ground. Many non-ornithologists, people who are actually not specialists on birds, think that all birds breed on trees. This is not true. These are actually lay their eggs on the ground. So it's in grassland and sand dunes. They produce a small number of eggs. And what's important, and you can see it in a bottom photo, a wonderful photo, that the chicks feed themselves and the parents only attend them, so they don't provide food for them. So how we study plover behavior? Well, we do what ornithologists did for several decades. We trap them. You can see the trap at the top photograph, and if you have a good eyes and if the internet is good enough, you can actually see the eggs inside the trap. So basically, we put this harmless trap on top of the eggs, and the parents circle around the trap and suddenly gets in. We mark them, we put colorings on them, or bands if you are an American. We measure them, we take photos, we take a sample for DNA analysis, and importantly, we actually record their behavior. So if you look at the bottom left photo, this is looking at the camera, which is facing towards the Kentish Plover nest. I want to illustrate what sort of data we also use. So this is a mobile phone left by one of my colleagues. So we picking up the mobile phone and we actually drove away. And within a short time, the mummy, the female bird, comes to the nest and happily start incubating. This is where the eggs are. So using these video images, we quantify what percentage of time the male or the female look after the young. And this is how the setup look like. You can see the video cameras, and also you can see the eggs, okay? So we do the research in a number of different ways. Sometimes we use a Jeep or a four-wheel vehicle. This is a funny photo because a Swedish friend of mine sent me this photo 2 days ago. Apparently this was in 1990, 30 years ago, and this was in my first study area in central Hungary. Ever since, we actually branched out, as Araxi mentioned, we branched out, we're doing work in many countries. And I still remember this very inquisitive donkey who was probably wanted to understand evolutionary biology from the scratch while I was watching some plovers. So if you watch plover behavior, one of the first things you notice that the male and the female share incubation. So if you look at the graph, this is the top graph, this is the temperature profile in one day in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. So when you start the morning, you have a breakfast in Abu Dhabi. The temperature is cool, about 30 Celsius. This is not Fahrenheit, Celsius. By around 8 o'clock, the temperature starts raising. You have 40 Celsius, and in the midday, it goes about 50 Celsius. Okay, so there's a massive heat in the middle of the day. You can see this on the birds. The birds are struggling. They're basically sitting on an oven, on top of an oven. It's just burning for the soil. So how do they respond to this? Well, this is the mid graph in this slide. So so in the early morning between 6 and 8, the male incubation and a female incubation are very relaxed. So sometimes the male incubate more, sometimes the female. And it took me a while to realize that there is one data point. Each data point is one nest, is one nest. This is where the father incubated nothing and the mother incubated nothing. When I joke, I would just say this is the future of humankind, where we're all busy with our own lives and we just ignore. There are so many fancy stuff in life, and the easiest thing is just to ignore our kids. But that's what this plover family seems to be doing. Now, if you go back to the same family, you see a very different pattern. This is the right bottom corner. This is midday, the hottest part of the day. Because what you see is that in every minute, either the male or the female incubates the eggs. So why is that? Well, it is because if they don't incubate the eggs, it will boil. And this couple who actually don't do a good job will produce nothing out of the breeding attempt. So in general, I see this is a good illustration of the significance of cooperation. When the environment is hard, when families are in hardship, the stupidest thing on the planet is to argue with your partner. You really don't want to do it. You want to cooperate, otherwise you end up like the silly Kentish Plover parents. It's a nice bunch of omelets. Instead of having happy kids, you end up with failed success. So once the parents produce the babies, then it's an interesting game starting. In most families, both parents, well, not most, in many families, both parents stay with the chicks. As the chicks get older, this is on the left panel. But sometimes the male and sometimes the female abandons the young. This is the graph you can see on the left. So in any time in the development, you have families which looked after only by the mother, only by the father, or by two parents. So this is one piece of evidence what we saw early 1990s. And in seemingly, it was a completely disassociated pattern that the plovers also moved around. Sometimes they visited sites, other areas, 10, 20, sometimes 80 kilometers away in search of new partners. And over the last 20 years or so, I became convinced that these two patterns, abandoning a family and finding a new mate, are actually linked. So in the coming few minutes, I try to explain how and what are the steps we actually did to uncover this relationship. So as I mentioned, in a normal Kentish Plover family, you have some males which have several partners. In other words, they are polygynous. So they have sequentially several partners, several females. There are, similarly, there are some females which also have several mates. So they are, technically speaking, polyamorous sequentially. They have one husband after the other. If you look at the numbers, it turns out that the females abandon the family more often than the males. This is a bit weird. So we did a series of studies to understand why is that. So first, one thing we did was actually we removed the mate, and we just asked how long it takes for a single female or a single male to find a partner. And it turns out that the mating times of males and females were very different. So if you were a female plover, then you very quickly found a new partner. But if you were a male plover, you struggled. So there were some males who actually struggled to try for 40 days, and he didn't manage to find a new partner. As an analogy, perhaps one analogy would be a small village somewhere in the mountains, where for whatever strange reason, there are many boys and very few girls. In this village, the life of an ordinary girl is wonderful because she can choose whichever potential husband she wants. But the life of a boy is a disaster because there is just so much competition for the remaining few girls. But you can reverse the logic. What if in this village, there are actually many females, many girls, and very few boys? Then the tables are turning, because in this village, the life of an average girl is a disaster, because she had to fight against other girls to get the boy she wants. And the same with the boys. Well, the opposite, the mirror image with the boys, because they are the kings. So they can choose whichever girl they fancy to marry. So this leads to an important point about sex ratio. So biologists often think that the white populations have 50-50 sex ratios. This is actually not true. So many white populations deviate from even sex ratios, but a bit of demography is illustrated on this graph. At conception is actually pretty close to 50-50. Let's talk about humans, the proportion of males. By the time they come out of mommy, there's slightly more males. And over the lifetime of many mammals, there are actually the male mortalities are usually higher than female mortalities. So at some point around 35 or 40, let's say human population switch to be female dominated. More females are in a population map. Now, as far as the terminology concerned, the sex ratio at conception is called primary sex ratio. At birth is the secondary sex ratios. And the topic of today's presentation is the adult sex ratio. These are the sex ratios of all adult males and females which can breed, not any given time, but the number of males divided by the total number of adults in the populations. So why is this interesting? Well, it actually is interesting from several points of view, and I just only illustrated a few ideas. Imagine this is something what people might expect, the even sex ratio, the same proportion of adult males and adult females. But there are biases. So there are female biased adult sex ratios in many mammals, for instance, where there are more females. And in birds and butterflies, interesting, the opposite, actually, there are more males. So why does this matter? It matters how many individuals from the same sex have to compete for mates, or for food, or for shelter, or escape from predators. So these are the issues we're hoping to answer. But in this short presentation, I only want to focus on the demography or demographic implications of sex ratios. So one of the early studies we did, we reconstructed the sex ratio in the Kentish Plover population. Why is that? Well, because we didn't understand how could it be that there are more males in the population than, why do the males unsuccessful, whereas the female plovers are very successful finding a new partner? So we suspected that there are more males in the population, and indeed, when you do the demography, you actually just try to multiply lots of proportions together. It turns out that indeed there are 6 times more male plovers than female plovers in the population. More recently, we extended this project to 6 plover populations, and if you look at the right bottom panel, the green means that the distribution, if the distribution is in a green zone, it means that in that plover population, there are more males, adult males than females. And if the distribution is the right, then it suggests that there are more females than males in the population. So to advance this issue a little bit further, I need to explain a little bit about comparative methods. So some of you are familiar, some others aren't. But biologists in general, not all biologists have lab coats. I was surprised to some TV presenters when I said, look, actually, I rarely have lab coats. I usually chasing animals or watching animals in the field. And these biologists, we often use comparisons, a cross-species comparison, which turns out at least 2,000-year-old in science. Darwin, actually, most of Darwin's arguments were actually based on comparisons. He did very few experiments. And even more recently, Maynard Smith, one of the smartest evolutionary biologists ever, he actually concluded that we need to respect the comparisons because they can reveal some novel patterns. And just to illustrate some of the comparative methods, we could postulate, for instance, that the fur color of bears might relate to the habitat. So if you have a polar bear, then you might think that, oh, the fur color is selected to match the environment, and vice versa in a grizzly bear. Now, the problem with this is that you only have one comparison. So statistically speaking, n equals 1. You compare grizzly bears, whatever thousands of grizzly bears you measure, it doesn't matter. And whatever 1,000 polar bears you measure, n equals still 1. You only have one comparison. But you can actually make more comparisons if you introduce the foxes. You actually get data on foxes and also stoats and visas and even from birds to test this general hypothesis that the habitat selects for fur color. And this is exactly what comparative method does. And with the two excellent colleagues, András and Rob, we actually started to push the sex ratio project in that direction. Remember, we're coming back to the painted snipe. This is the species I mentioned on the first slide on the cover, where actually the females are more ornamented than the males. So how is sex ratio relate to this? Well, as in most biological fields, we often have hypotheses, and in this field, sexual evolution, there are a number of ecological hypotheses. Sometimes people thought that there is a selection for females giving of the parental care because there's not much food, or the females suffer because there's a high nest mortality, and the female could be stressed. Darwin's hypothesis, if you remember, it focused on competition, on the number of males and females. But this is something what we followed up. But before I get into it, I like to illustrate that the ecological hypothesis to explain why some species like the ruff, remember, in these guys, the males fight and the females look after the babies. In the phalarope, as it says in the red phalarope, is the opposite. And actually, the females fight and the males look after the young. So ecological hypotheses are pretty unlikely because these species live essentially in identical habitat in Arctic tundra, or you can go to Africa and African marshes. You can have some of the sexual reverse species with breeding alongside a non-reverse species. So, having seen that the ecological explanation is unlikely, we actually tested whether the adult sex ratio would predict whether a particular species have so-called conventional sex or sexual reversal. Now, the easier is if I explain with the parental care. You look at the right bottom panel. You have the adult sex ratio, which ranges from huge male bias to hugely female bias. So the even sex ratio would be 0.5. And what you can see is that actually, when there are many males in the population, the males provide the care. And these are the species which are usually labeled sexual reversed. So given that the male provides, why do the males care? Well, of course, we think, we don't know, but we think this is because the finding of a new partner is very unlikely. So remember, there are so many males in a population that once you have a partner, you better stick to it. But because you're willing to provide care for your offspring, your partner can sniff it out, well, not literally, can work it out. So this is the situation she can deserve. So in male bias sex ratios, the females actually benefit from having so many potential partners, and they become polyandrous. So this is in the top graph. So in summary, what this result, remember this is association, so this is not an experimental result. But what this association suggests, that one variable, population sex ratio, predicts very well male versus female parenting and male versus female mating system. So if you want to recap where we are, Darwin's idea was that in conventional sexual species, the males compete because they have to compete. There are so many males in a population that they have to fight to access the females. And the sexual reversal was the opposite. So our results actually suggest the opposite. In other words, Darwin is correct because there is a link, an association between adult sex ratio and mating system. But this relationship is the opposite from the one he envisaged. Okay. So what are we doing now? We actually moving this research along the lines of understanding demographic processes. This is one of the projects I'm glad to do with Araxi and some other wonderful colleagues in Hungary, in Mexico and elsewhere. We try to understand why males and females, males or females die more often. And COVID is actually one example that actually the male mortalities are significantly higher, it looks, than female mortality, in spite of the roughly 50-50 chances of getting infected. So there are some patterns, sex bias is going on in terms of morbidity. How this feed into population sex ratios, and how this relates to mating system. And I use this Maurice Escher, the Dutch painter, illustration drawing hand, because I think in science we often think unilaterally. You always think, oh, A causes B, B causes A. But unfortunately, more often than not, this is wrong, because there are some complex interactions between the different terms and different processes. There's a wonderful book on the Serengeti rules, which try to explain how this complex regulation feedbacks could work in wild societies. This is something what we're hoping to understand in the coming few years. And more generally, what I try to do in the last something like 20 years is, if you remember the first few slides, I try to put together different pieces of a puzzle, somehow put it together in a way that few people did previously. And this could be illustrated by another Nobel Prize winner's quote, Albert Szent-Györgyi. He discovered something that all of us use well, not all the time, but very often, the vitamin C. And what Szent-Györgyi said, the discovery consists of saying what everybody has seen and thinking what nobody has saw. It is a very smart statement and quote. And of course, there are discoveries. There are all sorts of discoveries, luckily. But this is something what is, I think, is very interesting, because it requires you to see the same pattern, what everybody's seeing, from a different angle. So thanks for the attention, and I'm very happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tamás. That was an excellent presentation. Can you stop sharing your screen?
Yep.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have a few questions, and I'm gonna start with the analogies with between bird behavior and sex roles with what happens in human society. So can you comment on that?
Human societies are very difficult, obviously. It's very layered. So to some extent, humans are a lot more birds than primates. Birds have this nuclear family. So you have a male, female with a baby, sometimes several generations living together, as are in humans. primates tend to have a lot more diverse and more polygamous societies. So to some extent, birds are actually ideal to represent humans. Now, some of my colleagues work with human data, and we also see significant shifts in human sex ratios. There are studies which suggest that violence, for instance, in human societies are also related to human population sex ratio. But interestingly, not in a way how many people would guess, because the naive idea is that more men means more violent societies. And it turns out that that this is not entirely the case, because the violence can also turn out when there are many females in the population. So shifts away from 50-50 sex ratio in general can actually destabilize the society.
Okay, so following on that, staying with the analogy with humans, are there any biases in sex ratios in human societies?
Oh, there are. Think about emigration and immigration. So, for instance, one country where we work is Cape Verde. It's an island in the Atlantic Ocean. Largely the men who leave the country to find a job. So the local sex ratio, I never seen the data, just by talking to people. My impression is that there are female bias sex ratios, those ones who actually stayed at home. Many other countries, including the Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, who have guest workers, have hugely male biased adult sex ratio. So at least twice as many men than women in the society, because these men come to these countries to find a job. Now, how these sex ratios translate into mating systems is not trivial, because we have law, we have societies, we have traditions, we have religions. So the equation is not as simple as in bird societies. Just one example came to my mind. A few years ago, I edited a thematic volume of philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, and that was a very nice study from Australia. So in Australia, for about 200 years, were populated largely by Brits, who actually sent some of their inmates to Australia. And luckily, they have a very good record. These are largely men initially, but later there were women as well. And luckily, they recorded the sex ratios, which year, which town received this and that. And people went back and carried out some surveys. This was a contemporary population, and they worked out that the traditional sex ratios, how the generations by generation grew up, were reflected, and mating patterns and mate expectations, courting expectations, if you like. So it looks, again, this is a correlational study, but it does suggest that somehow unconscientiously we do take into account how many males and how many females are around us, at least according to this study. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have questions also relating to the pandemic. Marcela Lizalde is asking whether this pandemic phase, it's an opportunity to observe behaviors that you would normally not observe, both in humans and also in areas in nature that are now less populated or less visited by humans.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that social scientists are pursuing these lines. There are research teams which have data pre-epidemic, during epidemic, and hopefully there will be data post-epidemic as well. What I don't know any team who actually looking at sex ratio related issues. I think luckily even if in some countries the morbidity is actually just huge, the impact on the whole population sex ratio hopefully will be tiny. Yeah, I hope. So I really don't want to see if we have big effects, basically, and then nobody wants to see it, basically. Yeah, but it's a great question. If somebody want to work on it, yeah, give me a call, and yeah, we can think about it. Yeah, it's a great idea. Great idea. I hope the situation will not be too serious to see strong effects. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So we're also being asked whether species that are migratory, do they ever show differences in patterns of migration for males and females?
Yeah, there are. Yeah, there are. Migratory behavior is often different between the sexes. I'm thinking about shorebirds. There are species where males migrate first and females migrate first. So this leads to a technical difficulty, actually, because you need really good setup to estimate the total migratory population well. But unfortunately, what's happening now in many parts of the world, that migratory birds are persecuted, the habitats are rapidly disappearing, and I'm nearly certain that these effects are not the same for the sexes. So if you have one sex, one of the males or the females, which eat slightly smaller or bigger food, or more poisonous or less poisonous food, then it quickly can translate into different mortalities. Very few people looking at that sex ratio sort of effect in a non-breeding system context. I think there will be effects, bound to be. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so sticking with disease, do you think that females are always more resilient than males to infectious diseases?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think well, nobody knows the answer. We did publish a paper earlier this year which compared about 103 mammalian species, where we did find that across mammals, remember, these are only mammals, so these are our relatives, if you like, or if you don't like, it's the same. So in mammals, across mammals, females do live longer, females do seem to have stronger immune system than the males. Now, interestingly, in birds, which have a different chromosomal sex determination system, it looks the opposite. It looks that in birds, actually, the males live longer than the females. The males die more often, the females die more often than the males. And we had a paper a few years ago which showed that, interestingly, in reptiles, some of the reptiles like us, like mammals, they like a mammalian sex chromosome. In these reptiles, actually, the females also live longer. Well, we don't know, but we think that they live longer than the males. Whereas in a bird type of reptiles, the females die more often than the males. Well, whether this is all in the genes, it would be completely wrong to say, but there is a significant contribution to mortalities. We're actually trying to explore this in a project with Araxi, yeah, in future. Yeah. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you. So are sex ratios static, or can they vary within a species? And do you observe the same differences that you find between species also changing?
Yeah, well, they do. Most populations fluctuate. So, of course, you need a good population. So last year there was a nice paper comparing the sex ratio variation in Darwin's finches. This is essentially a closed population in Galapagos. It's very well monitored. There's something like 20–30% of swings in adult sex ratio in two Darwin finch populations, and I'm positive that in other populations we also see big changes. Now, how these within population changes translate into between population patterns, I really don't know. It is also a fact that if you look at sex ratios, let's say of red deer, then we're actually writing up of this paper, the red deer sex ratio data from this year, last year, 5 years ago, different for us, were significantly repeatable. In other words, similar, more similar than random. So in spite of the within species variation, as I mentioned, the changes, there are still significant differences between different different How and why this emerges, we actually, for vast majority of species, we actually don't know. We don't know. But it's a very good question.
Okay, so we're being asked whether what are the different types of sexual dimorphism that it's observed in birds, other than size dimorphism? Oh. And how do species with sex role reversal are reflected in plumage and size and other sexual dimorphism?
Thank you. As I mentioned, the association between dimorphism is not very tight. Different aspects of dimorphism. What we call dimorphism, if the males and the females are different from behavior, from plumage, from body size, from whatever. So in some species, the males, for instance, are smaller than the females, but still, actually, the males are the more sexually selected sex. Why is that? Well, because there are species. In fact, we wrote a paper on this with Martín Alejandro. We found that when the males are fighting in an acrobatic way, in other words, the agility matters. In this species, sexual selection can actually reduce the male size because it gives them maneuverability. So the males could be more ornamented, but still smaller than the female, because this is something what makes an advantage in terms of finding a partner and fighting off rivals. So as I mentioned, the different aspects of male-female differences are not related. In fact, we're writing a paper at the moment with an excellent colleague, Alejandro González-Boyer at UNAM, to explore how and why this might happen. We don't know these associations, surprisingly.
Okay. Are there any associations between mating systems and latitude?
Oh, yeah, it's well, not apparent actually. Now the latitude is a very, to some extent there are gross changes in productivity. Temperature is the obvious one if we go closer to the poles. But at the same time, actually, the amount of food seems to go up. So there's a peak, short time period for the breeding. So how does these different selection? On one hand, you can have a selection coming from a climate itself. If it's cold, you really like extreme environment, you have to cooperate with your partner. But at the same time, there are plenty of opportunities and lots of food floating around. How do these things balance out? I think it probably varies from one organism to another. I don't know any clear study which would say, well, it's tropics, you should see this and that, and in polar regions you should see this and that. But that's a good suggestion, actually. We can try. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and what are the associations between mating systems, sex roles, and parental care?
Yeah, it's. I didn't mention this at all. I just glossed it over. Sex roles have lots of definitions, so the experts don't agree what sex roles mean. So in the context I used, refer to breeding system variations, and two of the main components are indeed how many partners you have, and whether you yourself or your partner or both of you look after the babies. So just make it really, really simplistic. The two key aspects of sexual behavior, whether you have a single partner forever or for a year, or this is mating, it's called mating system, or whether you yourself or both of you or none of you look after the babies. So these are the two aspects, at least in my terminology. But I'm pretty sure that a lot of experts would not agree with me, and I'm happy to accept that there are other definitions of sexual behavior. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so during your fieldwork, have you observed any impact from human activity in the populations you study?
Yeah, well, I think this is a sad or realistic, unfortunately, pattern. So I was while I was focusing on plover and shorebird mating system, we went to Madagascar, we went to Mexico, we went to Brazil, we went to Russia, we went to Turkey, we went to a large number of countries. And you go back next year and you find that some of the habitats quickly disappear. So after a few years, I became conservationist because as an evolutionary biologist, I actually cannot really just see that nature is destroyed in front of our eyes. And I do think I actually wrote papers on this, that all biologists, at least some extent, they have to be conservationist as well. Whatever things we do, we might do some fancy neurobiology, we might do something fancy GIS, but we all biologists actually studying the results of natural selection, and it's our duty to actually contribute preserving this diversity. Unfortunately, it's going away very rapidly in most countries, and I think we as individuals, we should at least make an effort to slow down this process. Thank you.
Okay, so what are the effects of radio frequencies and other communication technology in bird behavior?
Oh, that's not my field. I don't know too much about it. So sorry, pass. Yeah, I'm sure. Well, I'm not. Well, I really don't know. This is way beyond my expertise. I hope not much. I hope not much. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So, what are the causes of differences in sex ratios?
Oh, yeah. So mechanistically, we can explore it. So you can actually quantify how many babies are produced by the parents. You can quantify how many juveniles, young animals or young humans actually mature, sexually mature. And then you can actually track down how long they live and when do they die. So this is just numbers. So this is just give you like numbers at different stages. You can calculate it. But answering why is a hugely difficult task, because you have to understand how these animals live, what are their diseases, how good their immune systems, what are their enemies, yeah, what kills them, how they kill them, their own species, so how competition influences. And some of these effects are very complicated. So we're trying, but I think the answer will not be trivial. It's still an exciting task, because there are some gross patterns, as I mentioned several times today. In mammals, females tend to live longer. In birds, somehow, males tend to live longer. This is a pattern in spite of local variations between species variation. So there are some patterns, nevertheless, in spite of the variations. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, do you see any differences in survival in captivity versus the wild?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, ask me in 5 years' time, and Araxi and myself, we will tell you. I don't know. I actually don't know any study which looked at it. Yeah, maybe not on gross on a broad scale. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's something. Are sex, okay, so the question is, what is the association between sex ratios and sequential hermaphroditism?
Oh, yeah, I mean, if somebody else, it's a great question. Yeah, this could be a nice study. If somebody is looking for a dissertation topic, contact me and we look into it. There is one system where there is a suggestion that population sex ratio relates to sequential hermaphroditism. We need to look at the literature, how general it is. Yeah.
Okay, Mauricio Betancourt, please get in touch with
Tamás, yeah.
Tamás, if you're interested in that topic. So, Tamás, I think we're gonna close the session. So thank you very much to everybody who put forward their questions. Again, Tamás, thank you very much for your presentation as well. And next week, there will be no talk by the Consortium of Universities for Science. So we're back the week after. So the 10th of November, we're not going to have a presentation. So I hope you can join us after that. So I'm going to pass the word to Dr. Urrutia. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Yeah.
Oh, thanks very much, Tamás, for a very interesting presentation. And it's a fascinating research you do. And we are very glad you accepted the invitation. And it's a wonderful presentation.
De nada.
Oh, gracias. Thanks. Tamás is a very good friend. He comes to Mexico very often. He has a lot of students in Mexico. So we are extremely happy for this very wonderful collaboration. Thanks again. And we hope we can see you very soon here in the university. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos. Los estudios abordan uno de estos temas centrales en la evolución, no solo de los humanos, sino de todas las especies, como son estos sistemas de reproducción. Y realmente es muy interesante la forma en que el grupo del doctor Szélkely los ha estudiado. Las aves, como vimos en el inicio, tienen una liga muy fuerte con nosotros desde los inicios, no solo con las cigüeñas trayendo bebés, o lo que usamos para representar a la paz, las palomas, sino que las aves pues presentan una serie de comportamientos similares que han sido la marca de cómo son estos sistemas de reproducción, el cuidado de los bebés y las diferentes formas en que esto trabaja. Realmente es, yo creo que uno de estos estudios extremadamente importantes y que están centrales desde los trabajos de Darwin y todos los estudios que hay, porque pues es la base. Literalmente sin un sistema de reproducción no habría vida en el planeta. Y de aquí pues se desprende todo lo que conocemos como el árbol de la vida. Entonces realmente pues muy atractivo. Ya la doctora Urrutia comentó sobre la siguiente parte del ciclo. Les reiteramos la invitación a que nos acompañen el martes en 2 semanas sobre la edad de las plantas con flores. Y les invitamos a que nos acompañen hoy en la tarde a la presentación de los 40 años de los buques oceanográficos de la UNAM a las 5 de la tarde por los canales de Fundación UNAM y de UNAM Global, y que nos manden sus observaciones, sus preguntas. Realmente es muy interesante el ver de dónde vienen todas las preguntas y que nos acompañen de tanto diferente lugar. Well, thanks again, Tamás, and we look forward for seeing you here in Mexico and for learning more about your really interesting research. Is the basis of the life evolution. Without these mating systems and the care of babies, there will be no life in this planet. So it's one of the central questions. And I very much like the quote you mentioned about how science is made. We all look at the same things, and from time to time somebody comes with completely different interpretation. So that's is the way discoveries in science are made. So thanks again. And
no, thank you, Jaime. Yeah, many thanks. It was a wonderful thing, and many thanks for having me. It was a great opportunity, and I'm glad that this is a successful series, and we hope to achieve some positive things in this quite negative world, unfortunately. So many thanks for organizing all of it. And Araxi, Jaime, and Dionisio, and Araceli, many thanks again. Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's a very difficult situation in many countries. Bueno, un comentario también final que lo mencionó nuestro presidente de Fundación UNAM. El ciclo está dedicado a los investigadores Mario Molina y don Guillermo Soberón, quienes representan esto que comentábamos de cómo es la ciencia hecha. Los dos se distinguen por su gran creatividad y también por su enorme generosidad. La ciencia, una de las partes importantes es que está encaminada pues al beneficio de todos, y la ciencia es la única actividad global que tiene estos sistemas de autocorrección. Entonces realmente es para nosotros en el consorcio un orgullo el dedicarle estos ciclos de conferencias a los doctores Molina y Sobrón. Muchas gracias y le paso la palabra a nuestro presidente de Fundación UNAM, el licenciado Dionisio Meade. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Jaime. Muchas gracias al doctor Szélkely, gracias a Araxi, gracias a Araceli. Solamente para cerrar, celebrar la constitución de este consorcio. No solamente ha sido una respuesta a la pandemia para seguir comunicados, sino que está sentando un precedente pionero para seguir enlazados en estos propósitos de compartir la investigación y el desarrollo. Ha sido este un gran ciclo de conferencias y subrayo lo que decía Jaime, se trata de investigaciones en curso, nos comparten desde el momento mismo en que se está realizando la investigación. Y eso significa pues estar anticipados también a cuál está siendo el rumbo del conocimiento, el rumbo de la investigación y de la ciencia. Esta presentación pues nos hace ver con entusiasmo estos aspectos de la vida, estos rituales por la vida, en donde se acredita que alrededor de esta expresión, vida, se mueve la naturaleza toda y que debemos por eso ver con interés, con respeto, con curiosidad, con visión científica, todo lo que se genera alrededor de esta investigación. Hemos comentado en ocasiones que una de las lecciones de la pandemia ha sido precisamente la de un mayor conocimiento del planeta y un mayor respeto de la naturaleza. Aquí se acredita con lo que se nos ha presentado esta necesidad. Hay que recoger y agradecer al doctor Szélkely que nos comparta este aprendizaje y que nos haga ver, como él lo hace, con más respeto, con más interés, la evolución de la naturaleza. Hay que felicitarnos por la constitución de este consorcio y hay que seguir potenciando esta fuente de conocimiento, compartir lo que se sabe, compartir lo que se aprende. Esto tendrá sin duda una evolución geométrica al compartir entre todos esta capacidad de conocimiento. Volvemos a celebrar que la universidad esté en el eje de este espacio, que siga siendo una fuente de investigación y que vaya a la vanguardia del conocimiento. Nos entusiasma mucho que participe tan activamente en la realización de este foro. Aquí han habido especialistas de la UNAM y ya ha habido también, con la presencia de Jaime y de Araxi, una presencia muy viva de otras universidades que forman parte de este consorcio y también del Colegio Nacional, que con su experiencia, su sabiduría y su conocimiento acumulado lo pone también a la disposición y al alcance de todos quienes forman parte de este consorcio. Solo para cerrar, recordar lo que decía Jaime, ya los invita al evento de hoy en la tarde de los 40 años de los buques oceanográficos y habremos de celebrar la próxima semana, el jueves 12, nuestra última mesa de las lecciones por la pandemia. En esta ocasión, las humanidades frente a la pandemia. Y yo creo que con este cierre habremos de haber recogido unas diferentes perspectivas, diferentes visiones sobre lo que la pandemia nos ha venido dejando en nuestra convivencia y en nuestra investigación. Gracias a todos, los esperamos en todos estos eventos y agradecemos nuevamente al doctor Szélkely la presentación que nos ha hecho y a todos quienes se suman a este consorcio, el esfuerzo colegiado que estamos haciendo por compartir el conocimiento, por compartir la cultura, por compartir la investigación. Muchas gracias a todos y quedamos emplazados para nuestra siguiente reunión. Buenas tardes.